She rides out of the city gates on a horse that has seen campaign dust before. Behind her, a walled compound on the edge of the Gobi Desert, its towers marking the edge of a kingdom that was not hers by birth, but is absolutely hers by authority. The men who manage the grain stores report to her. The soldiers at the gate take orders from her. When a neighboring tribe tests the border, she is the one who decides whether to negotiate, to send a message, or to ride. Her name is Alaqai Beki. She is the daughter of Genghis Khan, and she has been governing this kingdom alone after the death of her husband for nearly a decade. She will continue governing it for 20 more years after that, longer than most of her brothers held any single territory, longer, arguably, than any of her brothers held anything peacefully. You have almost certainly never heard her name. That is not an accident, and we will come back to exactly why. Because the answer tells you something important not just about the Mongol Empire, but about how history decides who gets remembered and who gets quietly removed. But first, the daughters. There were many of them. The exact number is disputed. Some accounts say 6. Others suggest more, depending on which wives and concubines the records acknowledge. What the records agree on is this: Genghis Khan treated his daughters differently from how any other empire builder of his era treated theirs. He did not marry them off and forget them. He gave them kingdoms. Not symbolic kingdoms, not ceremonial titles, actual administrative territories with populations and armies and tax revenues and the full authority of the Mongol name behind them. This is the part of the Mongol Empire that most history courses skip entirely. To understand why the daughters mattered, you have to understand how Genghis Khan actually thought about power. Most conquerors of the ancient and medieval world solved the succession problem the same way. They picked a favorite son, gave him the largest inheritance, and hoped the other sons wouldn't kill each other before things settled down. This almost never worked cleanly. Empires fractured. Brothers went to war. What had taken a generation to build sometimes collapsed within a decade. Genghis Khan saw this problem clearly. He had grown up in a world where Mongol tribes destroyed each other in cycles of raiding and revenge. The fragmentation was in his bones, so he tried something different. He divided the empire, but not just among his sons. He divided it among his children, and daughters, in his framework, were not lesser heirs. They were a specific kind of heir with a specific kind of function. The sons got the Great Ulus, the vast territorial domains at the core of the Mongol world, the armies and the campaigns and the titles of Khan. But the sons also got the rivalry. They got the paranoia. They got the intergenerational bloodshed that would eventually pull the empire apart. The daughters got something different. They got the borderlands. They were married into kingdoms that the Mongols needed to control without necessarily occupying. The Uyghur Confederation to the west, the Önggüd people to the south, the Oirat tribes further out. These were not small prizes. These were entire nations with their own cultures, their own armies, their own administrative systems. And a daughter of Genghis Khan became the living connection between those kingdoms and the Mongol center. The daughters weren't just symbols, they were governors. They held ulus, a Mongol word for a territorial domain, and a portion of sovereign authority. And when their husbands died, which happened more often than the official histories like to dwell on, the daughters did not step aside. They ruled. Take Al-Altun. Her marriage to the Uyghur ruler, Barchuk Artajan, was arranged before a single Mongol soldier crossed into Uyghur territory. Barchuk had come to Genghis Khan voluntarily, recognizing which way power was moving, and pledged loyalty. The marriage to Al-Altun sealed that loyalty into something physical. A daughter living in the Uyghur court, raising children who were half Mongol, administering a court that was now structurally tied to the Mongol network. The Uyghurs became part of the empire without a battle. That was not an accident either. That was the daughters working as intended. Further west, Checheikhen was placed into the Oirat tribe, a Turkic people occupying the corridor between the central Mongol steppe and the territories the Mongols would later push into toward Russia and Persia. Her presence there was not domestic, it was strategic. The Oirat corridor was a logistical lifeline. Armies moved through it. Supplies moved through it. Messengers moved through it. Checheikhen's marriage stabilized that corridor the way a garrison stabilizes a road. Her sons would go on to command Tumen, 10,000-man Mongol military units. The marriage Checheikhen was sent into became, within one generation, a source of military manpower for the empire. Her authority was the instrument, and that authority produced soldiers. What we are seeing is a pattern that most accounts of the Mongol Empire leave out entirely. The sons of Genghis Khan are in every textbook. Önggüd, the great Khan. Chagatai, the lawgiver. Tolui, the general. Jochi, the complicated one. They fought enormous campaigns. They also fought each other. The succession wars among the sons eventually fractured the empire into competing khanates that spent as much energy on each other as on any outside enemy. The daughters were the infrastructure. The empire ran on while the sons were fighting over the roof. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the part of the story that didn't make it into the textbook, hit subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from, because we have not even gotten to Alaqai Beki yet. And her story is the one that changes everything. Alaqai Beki was given to the Önggüd, a Christian Turkic people who lived on the southern edge of the Gobi, right at the border between the Mongol world and the northern reaches of China. The Önggüd were not a small people. They had their own walled cities, their own trade networks along the old Silk Road routes, their own military capacity. They had, importantly, been playing the dangerous game of staying neutral between the Mongol steppe and the Jin dynasty to the south. Alaqai's marriage to the Önggüd ruler locked them into the Mongol column. No neutrality anymore. The daughter of Genghis Khan was living in their capital. What happened next is where the story shifts. Her husband died. In most historical contexts, most empires, most cultures, most eras, this is where a woman's political story ends. She becomes a widow. She is sent home. Or she is remarried to whoever the new ruler decides to give her to. Her political agency, whatever thin slice of it existed, closes. That is not what happened with Alaqai Beki. She stayed. She governed. The Önggüd kingdom continued to function, continued to pay tribute to the Mongol center, continued to provide soldiers and supplies for Mongol campaigns, because Alaqai was there, managing the court, making the decisions, maintaining the relationships that kept the whole arrangement functional. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian who wrote the most detailed account of Mongol governance from an eyewitness-adjacent position, described her court in terms that he normally reserved for khans. Advisors approached her formally. Decisions came from her with the weight of a sovereign. She was not acting as regent for a son too young to rule. She was ruling. She remarried twice. Both marriages were strategic, to Önggüd noblemen who could provide military legitimacy and male heirs without displacing her own authority. Each time, she chose partners who understood she was the political center of the arrangement. Each time, she continued governing. The total span of her direct rule over the Önggüd kingdom is estimated at somewhere between 25 and 30 years. The exact dates are disputed, and that uncertainty itself becomes important in a moment. While Alaqai was holding the Önggüd together, her brothers were doing something very different. Ogedai became Great Khan after their father's death in 1227. He completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China. He sent armies into Russia. He built the Mongol capital at Karakorum. He also drank himself to death in 1241, leaving a succession crisis that consumed the next decade of Mongol politics. Chagatai governed his domain in Central Asia with a rigid punitive interpretation of Mongol law that made him effective but deeply resented. He died in 1242. His successors spent years fighting each other. Tului died young, 1232, some accounts say by drinking a ritual poison intended to cure Ogedai's illness, though historians still argue about this. His sons, including Munka and Kublai, eventually seized the Great Khan title through a coup that was barely disguised as an election. Jochi, the eldest, whose paternity Genghis Khan's own court quietly questioned, died before his father. His sons became the rulers of what would be called the Golden Horde. The sons tore at each other like the old tribes. Meanwhile, in the Önggüd kingdom, Alaqai Beki held water in her hands and did not spill it. The khatun system that she represented was the structural logic behind how all the daughters operated. A khatun was not simply a royal wife. A khatun of the Genghisid line carried inherited authority that could not be extinguished by widowhood. She could hold court, issue judgments, command troops in defense of her territory, and maintain correspondence with the Mongol center as a sovereign peer, not as a dependent. This was not informal. This was Mongol law. The question, then, is not why the daughters were powerful. The question is why you do not know their names. Sometime after the death of Genghis Khan and into the reign of his successors, something began to happen to the historical record, slowly, without announcement, over decades. The story of Alaqai Beki, along with the stories of Checheikhen, Al-Altun, and the other daughters, began to disappear, not from memory at first. The people who knew them remembered them, but from the written documents, from the official chronicles, from the records that would be copied and recopied and eventually become what we call history. A historian named Jack Weatherford spent years in archives trying to reconstruct what happened. He compared different manuscript versions of the secret history of the Mongols. The primary Mongolian chronicle, written around 1240, which is as close to an official Mongol account as we have. And he found something that was difficult to explain away. Sections were missing. Not lost to fire or flood, deliberately removed. In some manuscript traditions, passages about the daughter's governance were shortened to a single line or omitted entirely. The khatun system, the legal framework that gave daughters their authority, was described in progressively vaguer terms in later copies. The names of daughters who had ruled kingdoms appeared less frequently, then barely at all, then as footnotes to their husbands' entries. What happened was not hard to trace. Once Weatherford identified the pattern. After Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire was increasingly governed by a male court that had political reasons to minimize the daughter's authority. The sons and grandsons competing for the Great Khan title did not benefit from a historical narrative that said, and by the way, the daughters had equivalent power. A khatun with independent authority was a complication for a patriarch trying to consolidate control. So the records were edited, not in one dramatic moment, but across generations of copying, of summarizing, of deciding what to include and what to let fade. Anne Broadbridge, whose research builds on Weatherford's work, describes this as one of the most thorough cases of deliberate historical erasure from the medieval world. Not because the daughters were minor figures who simply weren't recorded, but precisely because they were major figures who had to be actively forgotten. Now the loop closes. You have never heard Alaqai Beki's name, not because she was unimportant, but because she was important in a way that powerful men, for generations after her death, found inconvenient. The pattern has appeared elsewhere. Byzantine empresses who held regency power, reduced to a line in a chronicle. Female administrators in Song Dynasty China, whose records survived only because a private diary was never submitted to the official historians. The masculinization of the historical record was not a Mongol invention. It was a human one. But the Mongol case is particularly sharp because we have enough surviving evidence to see both what the daughters actually did and what was done to their memory afterward. A woman governed a kingdom for 30 years, longer than her brothers, more peacefully than her brothers, and she was reduced to a footnote, then to an absence, then, for most people who have ever heard of Genghis Khan, to nothing. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured along the lines its founder had feared. The sons' descendants fought each other across what is now Russia, Iran, China, and Central Asia for over a century. The khanates that emerged were less connected, less administratively stable, more prone to collapse. The Önggüd kingdom, Alaqai's kingdom, held together longer than several of the sons' domains. The historians who survived to record the collapse wrote mostly about the sons. So here are 3 things worth carrying with you. First, the daughters of Genghis Khan were not ceremonial. They were governing. Alaqai Beki ruled the Önggüd kingdom for nearly 3 decades. Al-Altun locked the Uyghurs into the Mongol network without a war. Checheikhen stabilized a strategic corridor that armies would use for generations. These were not soft power gestures. These were executive decisions made by women who held real authority under Mongol law. Second, the erasure was not passive. Someone made decisions across decades to reduce these women's stories to footnotes and then to nothing. The manuscripts were edited. The chronicles were abbreviated. The khatun system was quietly written out of later accounts. If you want to understand how history gets made, look at who edits the copies, not just who writes the first draft. Third, and this is the one that stays, the most competent governors the Mongol Empire produced in its first generation were not celebrated in the empire's own records. They were removed from them. That is not a medieval problem. That is a human problem. And the fact that a historian in the early 2000s had to reconstruct these women's lives by comparing damaged manuscript versions, rather than simply reading their names in any standard account, tells you something about every historical narrative you have ever been handed. Which of these daughters' stories hit you hardest? Tell me below, because there are more names that didn't make it into this video, and if you want to hear them, I will make that video. Alaqai Beki rode out of those gates and governed a kingdom. She did it well. She did it for 30 years, and then the people who came after her decided that was not a story worth telling. We told it anyway.